Hello again. In this brief video, I'm going to summarize some of the impacts of the coronavirus pandemic on international trade. This is especially important to those of us who are engaged in multinational corporations, as well as international business. So there should be quite a lot of interest in what you see and what we discuss in this video. So with that, I'll just turn on the PowerPoints, assuming that I can do that, and we can get started. There it is. Okay. So just to get started, let's just run through a few facts, just a collection of facts that I gathered from a variety of publications and sources based on data published by the United Nations. And this one in particular, or these facts in particular, mostly came from one article in particular published by the Investment Monitor. So during 2020, the global economy dropped by about 4.5%. Believe it or not, that's a lot because it's hard to get a global economy to shrink. But foreign direct investments across borders shrank by 42%, and that was quite a bad. Developed countries were hit hardest because, among other things, their partners that are, if they were not developed, could not invest in larger countries. And so the larger countries didn't get very much investment. And the reverse is true as well. They didn't do as much investing. But in transition economies, those neither large nor small or rich nor poor sank 77%. The developing economy shrunk the least in terms of FDI, and so accounted for a much larger proportion of global FDI in 2020, not because its foreign direct investment increased, but simply did not decrease as much. Instead, those countries continued to receive investments. China's high-tech industries actually increased or received increased investment from offshore by about 11%. That was probably the best of all. And simply because the US foreign direct investment fell by about half, China became the world's top FDI destination for the very first time. So we have more of these shifts in the direction of China's economic importance. The inflows, foreign direct investment into Russia dropped by almost 100%, 96%. With regard to greenfield projects, that is building new factories, new plants, new operations entirely, they also were severely hit. Yet it was perhaps those projects, if they had already started in the lesser developed nations, were able to, those projects kept on. And that benefited the smaller or the less profitable nations. A big exception was the information and communication technology industry saw an 18% increase in greenfield investments, that is, in the building of entirely new facilities or new operations. The UN predicts that FDI recovery won't start and regain pre-pandemic levels until 2022, which means we've got to get through this year. And we will see that in some years, it'll probably take longer than that. And the growth in FDI that does occur this year and to a significant extent next year will be due to acquisitions and mergers rather than investment in business operations per se. Pardon me, I have a hoarse throat and I'll be taking a lot of drinks as we go through this. So here's an earlier, some information taken from an earlier publication. The one I saw you is, just showed you as the most recent, but the graphs are interesting in this exhibit, so I decided to show it to you anyway, even though the developed economies in this exhibit were projected to fall by 58%, whereas in the other one, let's see, it was 69%. So sources of information and experts will and the agencies that collect data will certainly differ and give you somewhat different answers. And that just proves once again that if economics is an inexact science, international economics is a lot worse than that. So you have to sort of keep your brain turned on and exercise some constructive criticism and skepticism when we look at these data. But I think the patterns in this case are all pretty consistent. So FDI flows to Europe in this review declined 80%. That's a lot, isn't it? Cross-border investments into Europe declined by 80%. And that's because Europe was so badly impacted by the coronavirus, making it difficult for people to go there, to ship goods there, and so forth. FDI flows to North America fell pretty sharply also, 40%. And of course, as the text says, the flows were uneven, but the decline in Latin America was 45% and 16% in Africa. What's particularly interesting, more than the text, is the lines in this graph. And you can see that the orange line represents developing economies. And they didn't fall much because they were already not real high. But it's that dark green line where we see the big drop. And frankly, the drop occurred beginning in 2017. But in 2020, it really plummeted below the amount of FDI into developing economies. And this was quite remarkable and brings to question just what the future of foreign direct investment is, with all the issues and impediments that exist today. And we'll talk about those. In terms of, I mentioned earlier that merger and acquisition deals would probably be the major source of FDI in 2021 and probably most of 2022. You can see what the investment in mergers and acquisitions was in the first quarter of 2020 when the coronavirus occurred. It dropped like a stone. So don't hold your breath for that one. This is a very important graph. It's occurred in a couple of publications that I've seen. But just as you look at this graph, this is foreign direct investment outflows from the top 20 economies in the countries that were the top 20 in 2017 and 18. But the projection goes through 2022. And so at this point, we can now take a look at the narrative. Global FDI flows expected to bottom out in 2021. That's this year. And recover some lost ground in 2022 with an increase perhaps of 10 to 15%. But that would still leave FDI about 25% below the pre-COVID level, the pre-pandemic level. And current forecasts show a further increase in 22, and at their most optimistic, that would get them back to the level in 2019. But that's if very optimistic estimates are realized. So it's going to be a while before international commerce regains the level that it was at before the pandemic began. And indeed, recovery of FDI to Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean is unlikely in this term. Africa, African nations, of course, there are many of them, but many nations in sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, have a lot of things in common. And those in Northern Africa, as you probably hear in the news, are subject to civil and military disruption. So Africa, Latin America, and that includes South America, Mexico, Central America, but Latin America and the Caribbean also, just like Africa, is not expected to see increased FDI, bringing it back to the 2019 level, even in 2022. How does this happen? I don't recall where I found this exhibit, but I sure think it's a good one. The way the pandemic and recession potentially occur is summarized in this diagram. Excuse me. First of all, we had the lockdown, or I should say lockdowns, in 2020. You remember them. And so projects that had begun, perhaps construction projects to introduce a marketing program and so forth, but they were slowed down or interrupted due to closure of sites. And cross-border mergers and acquisitions and other projects were slowed down or interrupted because of the lockdowns. And then because business slowed down, what did that mean? That means that businesses' profits slowed down, they lowered. And as this slide points out, about 50% of FDI comes from corporate profit reinvested. And so if corporate profits are lower, there's less available to reinvest. And as the pandemic expanded, and now of course we're in a new phase with the Delta variant. There are restrictions on new investment, imports and exports and so forth. So governments impose new rules, so cross-border mergers and acquisitions don't occur, and that's true of other projects, which are, and that's summarized on the next level down. So projects and new and existing projects and new investment decisions are lowered or reduced because, again, there's a lot of economic distress. And what's not really mentioned adequately here, except when this phrase investment restrictions, but governments place great restrictions. For instance, the US government has restrictions on travel from a number of countries right now. And it also has restrictions on imports from a number of countries now because we don't want to import more coronavirus. So these factors all together result in pulling out of investments, disinvesting, reshoring, pulling business back from offshore to the home country, and diversion, moving from foreign sources to sources that are closer to home, and shoring up supply chain resilience and higher autonomy by trying to bring the sourcing of materials and products that were obtained offshore back onshore and or closer to home. So this is the sequence that occurs, and you can see that these authors thought that some of these effects could last after next year. We'll have to see how that turns out. But these are some pretty strong forces, so they can certainly make their point. Again, I apologize for my coughing. I have a very hoarse throat. In this chart, I chose because it summarizes the international trade by commodity groups over the years from 2020 to 2024. And you can see the 100% line is the pre-pandemic level. And so architectural products and chemicals ought to find their way back to pre-pandemic levels, perhaps by the end of this year. But as we work our way down the chart, we can see that energy products, for instance, will take longer, and metals and mining even longer, heavy manufacturing longer, and apparel and textiles longer still. The longest of all, quite remarkable, according to the authors of this article, were expected to be automotive and transportation products, where the expectation for full recovery wouldn't be until about the end of 2023. So different industries will have different recovery terms. And you undoubtedly have heard a lot in the news about why that is occurring in some industries. You've probably heard, for instance, that the shortage of semiconductors has had a big impact on the automotive industry and has held back production levels. What you probably haven't heard is, first of all, many of those semiconductors are produced in Taiwan, which has its own problems right now. But in the United States, we have a large semiconductor industry, but it's largely out west. What's going on out west? Well, there is a record-setting drought. Why is that important? Because it takes massive amounts of water to produce semiconductors. As the semiconductors are being etched onto silicon chips, water has to flow over those chips, and whole reservoirs are being dried up where this is done. And so the manufacturing of semiconductors is being supported by fleets of trucks bringing water into Arizona and Central California and New Mexico, where these fabrication facilities are located, but without water in the drought, their production levels are greatly reduced. So as that happens, automotive production also is reduced. So here we are then looking at global freight flows. This is certainly important as well, because when we're trying to buy those semiconductors and get them across the water, or more importantly, when we're trying to get parts for cars or parts for machines or apparel, or of just about every kind of product you can imagine, the docks and ports in Asia are just jammed up. And coronavirus in those ports makes it very difficult for labor to function. Consequently, shipping backlogs and delays have become major in scope. So global trade in the second and third quarters of 2020, you can see this was taken from a forecast back then, to drop 13 to 22%. Global GDP, we found out already, it's dropped about 4.5%. Recovery back to the fourth quarter of 2019 was estimated to take 15 to 48 months. 48 months, of course, would be 4 years. So, but most important, as I looked at these data, were the transportation changes. 14% reduction in air cargo. No full recovery till mid-2022. Ocean transport down 14%, probably going to last some time. Container cargo is down 16 to 19%, according to this estimate. And it's probably worse than that. I read an article the other day that talked about how coffee cannot make it from South America to the port in Louisiana, in New Orleans, without tremendously increased costs. The reason is that the containers that usually are used are completely unavailable. And so other containers are being used, and they reach the maximum weight when those containers are not fully loaded. So the consequence of that is that the ships that bring coffee to New Orleans are not fully loaded. Their containers are not fully loaded. And so essentially, those ships are bringing a lot of air to to New Orleans. Again, I'm very sorry about my throat. I did not expect it would be this bad tonight. So different trade routes have been affected. And incidentally, you can see Asia to North America and North America to Asia. So we're taking a look at shipments from one Asia to North America or the other way, North America to Asia. We can see that because of the dispute between China and the US, the amount of shipments from Asia to North America has really dropped off. North America to Asia, when we're talking about essential agricultural products like corn and soybeans, have dropped, but not nearly as much as cargo moving in the other direction. When we're talking about Asia to Europe, the fall off is about 20%. Again, part of this is that production levels in Asia, including but not limited to China, have also declined. But in the case of Europe, the ability to purchase also has declined. And of course, there are blockages on some ports due to the coronavirus. Shipments from Europe to Asia, again, like in North America, not as severe as from the other direction, but more severe than shipments from North America to Asia. When we're talking Europe to North America and North America to Europe, there things are pretty much the same. There's been a 13% decline in both directions. And the same is true in shipments to and from South America. But these are all pretty severe reduction rates, aren't they? And so shipping and transportation, the transportation industry and shipping has really seen a major impact. And it's not simply due to supply and demand, but as I mentioned earlier, it's also due to effects of coronavirus on the workers, the people who work in the ports and on the ships, but especially in the ports. And so in several ports, ships are waiting and can't get into port because other ships are just stuck there. And so things have slowed down quite a bit. So what can we bring out of all this? First, foreign direct investment flows now are the lowest in 25 years. That's a statement that I found in a publication by the Brookings Institute, which is very reliable. what is it that's holding back foreign direct investment? And as we mentioned earlier, if corporate profits are down, and they certainly are, even though we've got a nice recovery going in the United States employment, for instance, has grown rapidly, but it's still not at the level that it was before the pandemic. And the same is true of several industries. So we've got a long way to go. And while profits are down due to higher costs and inflation brings with it lower levels of consumption because prices are higher. All of that means lower levels of activity, corporate activity, and lower profits. Government policies and embargoes to keep people and cargo from countries such as Brazil that has such a high level of COVID right now. And there are several countries. India, as I'm sure you've heard, has a very high infestation level. And so there are some countries that we either have to prohibit or restrict trade with. And then, of course, we also have the problem at the bottom of this slide that I'll talk about in a minute. Workforce reductions certainly occur when the people who work in ports contract the coronavirus. And and of course, the same is true of many other essential industries. And then we have this last one, the great power tensions. To the extent that there are great power tensions between the US, China, and Russia, that is they are countries that have major amounts of commerce. And if they're not trading with each other or trading with each other less than previously, whether it's for political reasons or health reasons, that's going to impact international trade. So what do we have? We have this very irregular, erratic, but contracted level of international commerce. There was one article about these problems that really caught my attention. I'm sure you can figure out why. But the article read, returns on US FDI and educational services. There are lots of foreign investments in education, US investment in particular. US universities operate institutions, subordinate institutions, or satellite institutions in many countries. And this quote says, and I might add that these folks who wrote this article are very authoritative, but they say that returns on US FDI and educational services are so low it would take 40 years to recoup their outlays. Worse, the payback period for investments in health and telecom firms is over 90 years. But fortunately, according to these folks, returns from investing in manufacturing are healthier, meaning that we're likely to get a payback on those investments sooner. But my point here is that the situation we're dealing with is not uniform, but rather differs from industry to industry. You see it. If I can just get there we go. Well, that's it. That's a summary of the international trade and foreign direct investment picture that I think just gives you an idea of what we're dealing with here. It's very troublesome, and we're going to have to come up with some new ways of doing business internationally because the old conventions, the old practices and procedures have been curtailed and interrupted by COVID. So now we're going to need to figure out whether we want to continue to pursue international trade at the level that we have in the past, or perhaps locate sources of supply that are closer to our shores, or maybe bring some of that international production that we have been investing in back to back home. And so there's a lot of strategic planning to do when it comes to international trade, and particularly foreign direct investment. And with that, I promised that this would not be a long video, and so I'm going to end it here and hope to see you again very soon.